president for 2 years, and I think it can fairly be described as a disinformation campaign. Now, I leave it to others to judge the extent to which it was deliberate lies involved, or it was involved reckless disregard of the truth, and I leave it to John Durham to shed light on the extent to which the narrative was instigated and propelled by Hillary Clinton's campaign to offset the problems she was having on her email server. But regardless, there's no doubt that I think that that episode did some very serious harm to our politics on many levels. So when I think of disinformation, initially I think that the mainstream media, if I can use that term, itself, and the extent to which it gets involved in advancing false narratives for perhaps political purposes. In fact, over the past 2 decades, I've personally seen an increasing number of instances where journalists have jettisoned journalistic standards and any semblance, and I'm talking some journalists, any semblance of objectivity to engage in deceptive reporting. The net effect of this, I think, has been, over the past few decades, the steady decline in the press's credibility, not just among Republicans, but many ordinary Americans. And the dominant perception today, I think, is that the media cannot be trusted. I think you all know, I think there were probably some more information provided this morning about the news media credibility being at an all-time low. And I think that that's very damaging to our body politic, because the loss of credibility means that the press is not in a position to effectively counteract all the lies and disinformation and wild conspiracy theories that are promoted by other actors, political leaders, organizations, activists on social media. And indeed, I think it's precisely because the media has lost its status as a trusted and objective voice in the public square that we're experiencing more and more unchecked mendacity in our public discourse. Very simply, when the cat's away, the rats will take over. And I think that's what's happening in the marketplace of ideas today. Let me just start by saying something about media-driven, what I consider media-driven disinformation. Under President H.W. Bush, and almost 30 years later under President Trump, I had a ringside seat on what I think were 2 of the most egregious examples of media disinformation. The first was a withering attack that was launched against George H.W. Bush starting in March 1991. Now that he's dead, everyone likes to look fondly back at him as a good man and a good president and so forth. But at the time, that wasn't the way he was treated. I detailed this in my book, but I'll spend a little time on it because it may not be as familiar to many of you as Russiagate is. And also, I view it as a starting point for real antipathy emerging between Republicans and the media. It's where the Republicans started viewing the media really as, or major parts of it, as having given themselves over really to political propaganda. So in March 1991, that was after his successful waging of the Gulf War, and he was riding high. He was 89% approval rate. And a year and a half to go until the elections. And that presented a formidable problem for the Democrats. Reagan had won initially 44 states, then 49 states, and Bush had won 40 states, and here he was a year and a half away from the election at 89% approval. And as if on cue, starting in March, he underwent the most savage and unrelenting carpet bombing, I think, by the press, that any president had experienced up to then. It was so sustained and so uniform, and it was based on distortions and lies. And there are really three parts to it. And I cover this in my book, but I'll just quickly summarize it. The first was the really gross coverage of the economy. In March 1991, one of the shortest and shallowest business cycle recessions had come to an end. The economy had turned around and was starting to expand again. And from March forward, there were 19 straight months of economic expansion. And yet, starting in March 1991, there was just incessant, day after day, press reporting about how terrible the economy was, equating it really to the Great Depression. And it was unbelievable at the time, and afterward, the professor at the Kennedy School did a study and said that from that time forward, 90% of the coverage, at the time the economy was recovering, 90% of the coverage was negative and became increasingly hysterical the better the economy got and the closer the election came. It's very critical of the media coverage. In November, after the election, it turned on a dime. From election day forward, 90% of the coverage or 86% of the coverage of the economy was positive from that time forward, from election day forward. The second part of this assault on Bush was this theme that he was completely out of touch with ordinary Americans, and during these terrible economic times. And this was memorably framed on a front page story in the New York Times, portraying Bush as never having seen a grocery store scanner. And the name of the article was, or the title was, Bush Encounters Supermarket, Amazed. Now, this was very damaging to Bush because it wasn't just one story. That became the theme of the election. This man was out of touch with average Americans during these painful economic times. And it was a complete lie. There was a video of the encounter that was behind this story. There was an AP detailed account of exactly what happened. And the exhibitors at this National Grocers Conference who had the interaction with him, described it later. And despite all this these clear facts as to what actually happened, it was completely distorted and lied about. He was being shown and brought over specifically to see the latest technology in scanners, the new scanners, which he recognized were new. He recognized scanners and said, oh, this is the new version, the new technology. Yes, we have very amazing new technology. They can now read labels that have been torn up. So we're going to tear this label into 5 pieces, and we're going to run these items through, and they will be recognized. And that was done, and the exhibitor said, this is amazing stuff, isn't it? And the president said, yeah, well, that's really something. And from that, the idea was that he didn't know what a scanner was. And despite efforts to correct the record, it's just ignored. And to this day, to the extent Americans have heard about the incident, they will all believe that Bush didn't know what a grocery store scanner. But as I say, that was sort of the basis, and it was repeated and repeated ad nauseum. And the third aspect was the perpetration of the Iraq-gate scandal. And sometimes Trump didn't like to hear it, but I used to tell him, you're not the first president who's, been attacked this way and had a phony scandal used against him. The Iraqgate scandal wasn't as complicated as Russiagate, but it was as mendacious. Starting in March, the president was riding high because of his handling of the Gulf War, and the media and the Democratic leaders started like an Australian tag team with the same theme, that he doesn't deserve credit for the war because he's the one who precipitated it by secretly and illegally arming Saddam Hussein. And as Gore, who was running as vice president against him, was saying, he doesn't deserve credit for putting out the fire because he was the one who ignited the fire. And the story was that he had secretly arranged for $1 billion in loans or loan guarantees, and that Saddam could use this cash to buy weapons. And, that simply wasn't true. What this was an agricultural credit program that was not illegal. It was not secret. It had been going on a long time. And when the time that Bush was asked to renew these credits, he actually reduced them dramatically to $390 million worth of grain. And what happens under these programs is the banks pay the farmers send the grain to Iraq, and Iraq has 3 years to pay it. There is no cash given to the Iraqis, just the grain. And there's never a scintilla of evidence that any grain was diverted. So at the very end, and actually after the election, but as the election approached, and it finally sunk into the brains of some of the people who had been flogging this story, that these were agricultural credits. What that did was it freed up his foreign money. I mean, his hard currency, so he could spend it on weapons and didn't have to buy any grain. No, what actually happened was he owed $1 billion roughly for past grain shipments, and he said he wasn't going to pay it because the United States was canceling the agricultural credit. So by extending another $390 million, Bush forced him to pay back the past loans. So that's soaking up almost $1 billion of his hard currency. So those were the actual facts. And yet, I spent most of that year being called a criminal by the New York Times and everything because I would not appoint an independent counsel because I said there was nothing illegal. So the truth never caught up with the lies, and polls on election day showed that 2/3 of the American people had serious concerns about Bush's handling of the arming of Saddam Hussein and the Gulf War. So it is probably one of his greatest accomplishments was turned into a liability. There are several postmortems done by a federal judge, the Clinton Justice Department, a former department official, and a journalist, Stuart Taylor, who wrote for the American Lawyer and the Legal Times, and all of them just demolished this thing, this whole pseudo scandal. Now, Stuart Taylor, at that point, I describe him as a classical liberal journalist, but he was very dedicated to the truth. He was the guy who stood up and was the first to stand up and say, wait a minute, these Duke lacrosse players are being railroaded here, so this is wrong, what's going on. So he had a passion for the truth, and he spent a lot of time looking into it. And I just want to read what his final conclusion was, because he said, I want to explain why I spent so much time on this. He said, because the falsehoods and distortions that pervaded reporting and commentary about Iraqgate in 1992 were truly outrageous. Because compelling evidence of their falsity had been piling up, virtually ignored by the media. Because phony scandals like this one are a recurring phenomenon. Because the costs, which include the smearing of innocent officials of all ranks and the spread of cynicism about government, the media, and public affairs are heavy. And because all this suggests that the media are badly botching their fundamental job of telling the truth about major public issues due to political bias, sloppiness with facts, and old-fashioned sensationalism. Now, if you Google Stuart Taylor today, he's described as a conservative-leaning journalist. So this was the time the Republicans, I think, said, you know, and again, this is mostly the national media, but these people are an extension of the Democratic Party. They're a propaganda machine. It was so obvious, and that's why the bumper sticker appeared at that time. Annoy the media, re-elect Bush. And that attitude continued to get stronger to the time of Trump. And Trump was able to capitalize on that and tap into that frustration and run directly against the media. And I think that was a very close election, as you all know. And I think Trump's calling out the media and his belligerence toward the media actually was one of the key factors that enabled him to win. Now, obviously, the other great disinformation campaign, I think, was Russiagate. And I'm not going to spend time on that because I think you're all generally familiar with its trajectory. And, you know, it sort of emerged at the time that Hillary Clinton made a decision during the summer of 2016 to try to create a scandal about Trump and his relationship to Putin, and that he might have been involved in Russian interference, and went all out flogging the dossier, commissioning the dossier and flogging the dossier. But what I always found interesting about this particular episode was, before the election, the media was pretty, they didn't buy it, they just dismissed it. They realized, I think, that it was fishy with a crock. And so, no one bid. It was only after the election that all of a sudden people started doubling down and going crazy, and as Trump would say, and I know it's a grating phrase, but you know, Russia, 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 and that's what it was. And whatever one thinks of Trump, he was the duly elected president, and in my mind, he deserved it. He wasn't the candidate I supported for the nomination. I agree with his policies, but he was the duly elected president, deserved an opportunity to get his administration off the ground, and I think that whole thing was a grave injustice. It really hobbled his administration, and the idea, the claim was made, people are very upset about January 6th. I was upset by January 6th, but people forget that the claim was made and continued to be made that he was not a legitimate president, and that justified the resistance, which is not something we should accept in a democratic republic, the idea of a resistance against the duly elected government. And, you know, I think it played a big role in polarizing the country. I think it did a lot of damage to our foreign policy. Everyone knew that we had a window. I remember Clinton's reset, right? Hillary Clinton's reset. Everyone knew in the foreign policy establishment that there was a window where we could maybe reach a modus vivendi with the Russians, and there were some things that could be done that maybe would have stabilized the situation. But for 4 years, Trump's hands were tied. He really could not deal effectively with Russia and explore whether we could put our relations on a sound basis and stabilize the situation in Europe. And finally, I think the thing disposed a lot of Republicans, especially the most avid Trump supporters, that the Democrats and the media will do anything to get Trump. And this predisposed them, I think, by the time of 2020, to buy into the false narrative that the election was stolen. And I think you may have already seen that earlier this week, the Columbia Journalism Review published a 25,000-word article by Jeff Gerth, doing a whole retrospective on the media's handling of Russiagate. And it's very critical. invite you to look at it if you already haven't, but it calls for a tough self-examination by the media. Now, journalism isn't the only institution that is seeing its professional standards eroded. I think it's happening across many of our institutions, in government, in the private sector, science, medicine. I think an increasing number of people are willing to cut corners and sacrifice institutional values with the idea that they're actually advancing some greater purpose. When we create institutions, we have an end in mind. For example, the criminal justice system, we're trying to achieve justice, not in a cosmic justice sense, because we can't do that. We're fallible human beings, and we really can't assure that. But we've created a system, an institution, that over time, we hope, because of its disciplines, its values, its processes, will be a fair and accurate way of determining the truth about a crime and imposing an appropriate sentence. So that's what the institution is all about. And it has to be governed by these disciplines and values, due process, at the adversarial process, the rules of evidence, and so forth. And for these institutions to work, the people involved have to be faithful to those intermediate and instrumental values. They can't say, well, this isn't really getting us where we need to be in terms of justice, and so let's give this stuff short shrift and jump right to the end. Now, when that's done on one side of the political spectrum, we all know about the right-wing death squads that have emerged in some countries, developing countries, where they say, you know, all this process is for the birds. We know this person is guilty, so let's just jump to the end point and knock him off. Why go through all this stuff? Because it's a higher purpose. We know he's guilty, and it's justice that we're achieving. And obviously a system where people can set themselves up and say, we know he's guilty, and we don't have to go through the discipline, is a dangerous system. Do I trust people today in the criminal justice system to faithfully carry out and abide by the values and standards in our system? Or will they say, well, I know this guy is guilty, or it's really important for the country this guy go to jail, so I'm going to cut the corner here. I'm not going to require the same quantum of proof that I might, or I'll look through everything with skeptical eyes because I really want this case to go forward for higher reasons. And the fact is, over my experience over 30 years, the answer is yes. Regardless of the party, there are a lot of people still in our justice system who can check their politics and their biases at the door and become real and act as real professionals, in that they can disinterestedly apply standards in a neutral way, even when the outcome doesn't accord with their wishes. But I have noticed over the last 30 years an increasing number of lawyers at the department that don't do that, can't do that. I would point out, for example, that in my last tenure, the first time I didn't have any trouble with leaks. This time, every case that I can think of that was embarrassing to Republicans and would hurt the Republicans politically, every investigation was leaked to the press, including some that were very consequential for his runoff. In 2020, it was leaked and became the centerpiece of all the commercials against him in Georgia, and I think that election was 12,000 vote difference or something like that. And that meant the control of the Senate. But everything that was damaging to Republicans was leaked. There were a number of things in the department, you read about some, that would have been very damaging to the Democrats if it was leaked, and they were not leaked. But the fact that there are people in the department that will do that kind of thing was shocking to me, and it does show an erosion of people's fidelity to the institutional values that are so important for these institutions to work. And I think the same thing's happened in journalism. I think the institutional goal of the media is similar, which is to get it objectively at the truth. As Adolphus Ox said, to give the news impartially, without fear or favor, regardless of any party, sect, or interest involved. And we at Justice always use it. We administer justice neutrally without fear or favor. Now, I've known many great journalists and still have friendships with many who I think do that. But I see an increasing number who don't seem to be able to do that. And they see themselves more as agents of societal change and progress. It's like some young lawyers go to law school and they're saying, you've got to use the law to achieve change. And they interpret that to mean use the Department of Justice as an institution to go out there and achieve some higher end than the job you're supposed to be doing. And I think the same thing is happening in the media. There are two ways of thinking today that I think are contributing to that. One is, I think, this militant progressivism that has emerged. And I think the essence of progressivism today is that there's a clear directionality to history, and that the core idea is that there's some preordained scheme of natural earthly perfection and equity that we can achieve collectively as a society. And it's our destiny and our duty to pursue this final end, which is to be achieved through political and societal organization and activity. And one's virtue and the meaning of one's life is bound up with the extent to which people cooperate with that march to this earthly nirvana. And it's essentially, it's what Buckley used to call the immanentizing the eschaton, the final things that the Western Christian view was the final things are transcendent. This is merely an antechamber to that, and what that kind of thinking does is say, no, the final end, all there is an earthly end, and it's a collective end. It's not the individual's salvation, transcendent salvation. It's a collective end that we can achieve here on earth. And, I think one can see how that kind of thinking, even with people who don't buy into the whole thing, or don't think they buy into the whole thing, some of its premises seep into everyday thinking. And I think you can see how that could be a very powerful solvent, dissolving loyalty to sort of troublesome intermediate and instrumental standards of institutions, and how it could justify sacrificing them to achieve some higher purpose. The other strand, I think, in contemporary thinking is that I think tempts some journalists to give short shrift to the value of objectivity, is the idea that there's no such thing as objective truth, or if there is, no one really can say for certain what it is. And this is reflected in the currency of the term narrative. I remember that started to pop up about a decade ago, and I said, oh my God, here we go. And now it's the narrative. And the word suggests an absence of verifiable fact and objective truth, and that there's only a story, and that all stories are experienced subjectively, or constructs that may or may not correspond to reality. And everyone can have a narrative. You have your narrative, I have my narrative. Who's to say whether yours is right or mine is right? But that tempts people to chisel the facts to fit the narrative. But whether you agree with that or not, I think you will agree that it's critically important that we have institutions in the public square that are trusted and credible sources of information. And I think today that's one of the crises we have. The media is not playing that role. And not only is it not playing the role, but it's also helping to destroy the credibility of other potential sources of trusted information. And there's a certain cynicism because of the battering that people receive from the media. And I think this is only going to be corrected when individual journalists and entities of the Fourth Estate see the need and the critical value of restoring as much credibility as possible in this cynical time, and become the kind of impartial reporters of news that we desperately need in a self-governing democracy. Let me just say a few words about the disinformation that comes from non-media sources. I think President Trump's election night claim that the election was stolen in 2020 might fairly be described as an example of disinformation, and I'll leave it to others, to the special counsel, to determine whether this was an example of deliberate or reckless falsehood. Now, it's important to say that it's okay to challenge elections, and we can't inhibit that. People should be able to challenge elections. But pretty soon into it, you have to be able, it seems to me, to point to actual evidence of fraud. And those legal challenges have to be brought within the processes and the time frame provided by law. And what I thought was deeply wrong about President Trump's behavior after the election was his ipse dixit, flat-out assertion that at 2 in the morning on election night, before there was any way this could really be known, that the election was being stolen by major fraud. And I also thought that it was clearly gravely wrong for him to press ahead with these claims after the states had formally certified the votes and there was no official dispute within any of the relevant states. That occurred on December 14th, and after that there was no lawful way to overturn the results of the election. It was over, which is why I felt I could resign on December 14th. The fraud claims, as you will recall, were stated with such panache and so authoritatively and with such conviction that it was a little off-putting. What do they know that I don't know? I mean, why are they so sure about this? And all these details about the Dominion machines and so forth. Very concerning, and I felt there has to be somebody out there who can address this. And that's why I scrambled to get on top of all the different allegations that were being thrown out by the president's team. And as I looked into them, I saw that they were baseless. And I felt I was in the best position to push back on that. But 2 years after this, a majority of Republicans still think the election was stolen. That's not what I'm saying now, rigged, which is the way of saying, well, maybe it wasn't criminal fraud, but there was unfairness and so forth. And as I've already said, one of the factors there, I think, was the handling of Russiagate. But I also think this orgy of gamesmanship, political gamesmanship, and election rule changes in the run-up to the 2020 election made people the Republicans, more prone to believe that the election was rigged. And some rules were changed that were sort of tilted the playing field, and others increased the opportunities for fraud by stripping away some of the measures that are meant to protect the integrity of an election. But many in the media, I don't think, appreciate that there are really two different questions when it comes to the people's faith in election results. Yes, one set of questions is, can you show that a particular election was determined by fraud? But it's very hard to prove it after the fact. I don't think there was material fraud in the past election. I think I know why Trump lost the election. but it's still a hard thing to do. But that's the one question. I think the more basic question, the more important question, the question I was worried about, was that even before you get to that point, if people see the dilution and the stripping away of the protections that are supposed to ensure the integrity of the election, they will not have confidence in the outcome of the election, regardless of whether you can show fraud, period. And that's the phenomenon I think we're seeing today. Now, some people say the January 6th episode is a continuing, that scenario is a continuing threat to democracy. Some authoritarian government stays in power, takes power regardless of the outcome of an election. I really don't think that that's the nature of the danger. I think as long as a losing candidate cannot point to persuasive evidence of fraud, and as long as they're allowed to exhaust the lawful remedies that they have, I don't think there's a risk that a candidate is going to ignore those election results and stay in office. I think our governmental institutions are too strong. And I think the fact is that in 2020, our institutions held the line. The executive branch, all but a small group of people and a lot of outsiders, our courts, Congress, and all three branches in the states that were involved. No one went down that path at all. So I don't think that that's the real danger. I think the real danger is a situation where the election results are more equivocal, and it's much harder to show that there was a particular victor, and that is what will leave the vacuum. And that's why I think our task today is to stop allowing political gamesmanship and set rules that will lead people to have confidence in the election. And that's why I said before the election, people were playing with fire. They thought they were being so cute. Let's throw this rule in, let's throw that rule in. There are consequences to it, and we're seeing the consequences of that. And I think the recent experience in Georgia, the Florida election system shows that we can run elections, close, razor-thin elections in Georgia, particularly this last time around, that people will ultimately have confidence in and assure integrity, but also without artificially suppressing turnout. So finally, let me say what I think the clear and present danger is to our democracy. I hear people say, the threat to democracy. I think the real threat to democracy today is depreciation of the First Amendment and the values of a free and robust public discourse that it stands for. And I think that's indispensable to self-government. Don't talk to me about voting first. What comes before voting is conversation. How can you govern yourselves as a people unless you're able to communicate and try to reach agreement on things and so forth? Voting comes as a way of resolving disputes that emerge after public debate or during public debate. So the First Amendment, I think, is indispensable. And instead of building up media institutions that have the credibility to rebut lies in the public square, there's a building constituency for censorship. Don't rebut the lies, just stop them from being stated. And I'm talking about both governmental censorship, but also private action to either remove speech from the marketplace of ideas, or to cancel and punish people for stating things that are not popular or controversial. And subtracting speech not only dilutes the public conversation, but it also alienates the people, the minority. When people are able to participate or see their positions articulated in the public debate, they're more prone to accept the outcome even if it doesn't conform to what they wanted. But if they're gagged, things can get explosive. And I think people have to recognize that. I very much agree with the classic doctrine in the First Amendment, which is that the answer to bad speech or false speech is more speech, not imposed silence. And the idea behind that, obviously, is that the truth is strong enough to prevail. And it's a messy process, but it's the only one that's compatible, I think, with our democratic ideals. You know, everyone has the right to put in their 2 cents. Everyone has the right to put in their 2 cents, whether or not they're stupid or wrong. We don't take people's vote away from them if they're stupid and wrong, if they believe terrible things and so forth. They still go out and vote. So why would we take the right to have to state their 2 cents away from them if they're stupid and wrong? The idea that we should have some small group of guardians, whether they be in a private company or some government agency, that sort of sifts out acceptable things for the public to hear, betrays a fundamental distrust of popular government and really turns the democratic ideal on its head. So I think the only way we're going to get through, this is not the entire solution, but I think part of getting through our current problems as a society is that our media, which is so important to the proper functioning and health of a democratic republic, does engage in some careful self-examination as to why people no longer trust them. They're no longer a trusted voice. Second, I think we need policies that proliferate voices. In the 10th Federalist paper, Madison framers really said what they thought the threat to democracy was. They thought the threat to democracy was a situation where a majority can be quickly energized, galvanized, and that transitory majority would then oppress the minority. And they thought that wouldn't happen. We're such a big country, it'd be very hard to galvanize a majority in the country. There's so many local interests, we're so big, and as Tocqueville said, the press was a fundamental bulwark against that. Not necessarily because of their sound judgment, but because of their multiplicity. These were the days when Troy, New York had 12 newspapers. And so just the sheer multiplicity of voices is the fundamental bulwark against people getting whipped up very quickly. And as if you hit people from one side continuously, you will galvanize them and you will create an overweening majority. And it bothers me today that the consolidation, also the groupthink, the sort of common philosophy and common script that a lot of the monolithic thinking that a lot of the media engages in, and the concentration in big tech and the digital platforms and the role that they can play on the flow of information. I think this is dangerous, and I think we need to do everything we can to ensure and nurture as many voices as we can. And finally, I think we have to unabashedly embrace the value of the First Amendment and stop being afraid of speech. The idea that, oh, you shouldn't say that. Do you realize that that's offensive? Well, I mean, the basis of the First Amendment was we don't, sticks and stones break our bones. We're not going to give a heckler the veto over speech, because the speech is ultimately more important. And we have to embrace the First Amendment values and do everything we can to encourage a broad, robust debate and unpopular views sometimes, or views that don't correspond to the consensus being able to be stated. So with that, I'll stop. Appreciate the opportunity to talk to you, and I'm glad to answer